Good evening and welcome to week 4 of our ongoing series on sexual apologetics. In the first week, I talked about the 10 top myths of the sexual revolution, and then in week 2, I talked about the reasons for sexual apologetics and how it is one of the most critical issues facing the church today, and our failure to address this has led to decline in influence of the church and decline in numbers within the church. Last week, I addressed the 4 major challenges directed toward biblical sexuality from people who claim to be Christian, who come from within the church and challenge it. This week, I'm going to cut into the root of it all. What is biblical sexuality? How am I going to define it? And what does science have to say about the major core precepts of biblical sexuality? Again, you can check the PowerPoint files, the recorded presentations, and accompanying articles on my website at swilling.com. In the top right-hand menu, there's resources for a seminar on sexual apologetics, and that's where you would need to click. You can also email me, and again, 4 sources that I think are very good, reliable, trustworthy, balanced sources for information on sexuality and science are the Christian Medical and Dental Association at cmda.org, National Review at nationalreview.com, Breakpoint, the ongoing ministry from the Colson Center, and the Public Discourse. So today's talk is titled Male and Female Created He Them. In Genesis 1:27, we read that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, if I had more time, we could go into great depth on exegeting the passages and laying out the biblical framework for what human sexuality is. I think probably most of you already know what the Bible has to say, and there are plenty of people who can do it. So in the interest of time, I'm going to assume that you're on board with this, and if not, I can direct you to other places. The 3 main things that I will address in this talk and in the talk next week are here. Number 1, that gender differences are innate. Number 2, that humans are designed for lifelong monogamy and celibacy apart from marriage. Number 3, that we are broken, and ignoring principles 1 and principles 2 leads to considerable civilizational and societal and individual harm. Now, we might think that some of these are uncontroversial, but in fact, those core precepts have been repeatedly challenged and denied by much of or most of secular society, most other worldviews, and from many who profess to be practicing Christians. Let's first talk about the gender differences. There's a history behind this. Beginning in the 20th century with the second wave feminism, there was an ongoing push to deny that there were any real differences on a mental, social, psychological, personality level between men and women, that all the differences we experienced, and common sense tells us that these differences exist, you only have to look around you. They claim that all of these are culturally created. They're artificial, that they're not our natural state, that if you teach little boys to play with dolls and little girls to play with trucks, they'll all just grow up to be exactly the same. Simone de Beauvoir was one of these early second wave feminists. She was an interesting person, a consort of the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. And in one of her books, she wrote, On ne naît pas femme, on la devient. That's translated various ways, but basically it means we are not born a woman, we are made one. We are made into one. Believe it or not, there's actually an entire book of essays exploring the ramifications of that. I don't recommend it. I have not read it myself and probably won't. But this idea started acquiring a lot of purchase in some of the more elitist, rarefied institutions of Western civilization over the latter part of the 20th century. Henry Gleitman was quoted by Leonard Sachs in his book as saying, "Most of the differences we observe between girls and boys are socially constructed." Anne Fausto Sterling, who fancies herself an authority on gender development, emeritus professor at Brown University, said many years ago, "Our current notions of masculinity and femininity are cultural conceits." Daphne Joel at Tel Aviv University 2015 says there is no sense in talking about male and female nature. So we understand that this viewpoint is common, but how widely is it accepted? And in fact, it became quite widely accepted within certain elements of society, particularly in academia, some of the more esoteric fields of medicine, and in philosophy. So back in 1965, there were a pair of identical twins, David and Bruce Reimer, who were born in Canada, I think in Vancouver. The boys had a problem with urination, and so a medical circumcision was prescribed. Bruce Reimer was the first to undergo the circumcision, and the circumcision turned out to be a disaster. They used an electrocautery device which burned flesh, and the circumcision led to irreversible damage to his penis. They felt there was no way it could be reconstructed or that he could function as a male. Now, about this time, John Money, who is an activist in the realm of gender, was at Johns Hopkins University. He started their gender identity clinic, and he was a huge, widely publicized advocate of this notion that there were no innate differences between men and women. And he was making a lot of appearances on television. Well, the Reimers heard about John Money, and they took the poor injured Bruce to John Money at Hopkins, and Money said, "No problem. We can easily construct a vagina on this poor child. We'll remove his testicles and we'll turn him into a girl. We'll raise him as a girl, and he'll live a happy, flourishing life as a female." Obviously, he would never be able to conceive children, but otherwise there would be no difference. And they proceeded. They agreed to this, and the procedure was done. Over the years, John Money continued to write up this and report it as one of a triumph of medicine, a triumph of his clinical skills, and a vindication of his theory. As it turned out, years later, he was deceiving the entire public in all this, that in fact the true story was very different. Bruce, who was renamed Brenda Reimer, never accepted the role of being a woman or being a young girl. He fought it every step of the way. He engaged in normal male activities, sought to act as a man. By the time he was about 11, he came to realize what had happened. And by the time he was 15, he had openly identified himself as a male, dispensed with all of the charade of pretending that he was a woman, and changed his name back to David. So he became David Reiner, from Bruce to Brenda, now back to David. He struggled throughout life. He did marry and adopt kids, but you can imagine that didn't work out well. And sadly, by age 38, he committed suicide. So this was a long, tragic history based on this idea that gender identity is just a social construct and that men and women were basically interchangeable. The National Institutes of Health declared the 1990s to be the decade of the brain. And although, of course, research in neurosciences had been going on for decades before that, it really got more funding and started to become a much bigger enterprise, leading to a lot more information about human thinking and human cognition. And what has emerged out of this is, over the last 30 years, we've learned that there are actually very consistent, reproducible differences between men and women across a wide range of domains, including neurological, biological, psychological, and social measures. Leonard Sachs, there in the book on the right, is a family practice doc who spent a lot of time investigating this, following the research, and meeting with public school teachers, speaking at public schools, because that's his main focus. And where these differences matter most really are in the young children, much more than adults. Hearing, for instance. Now, between men and women, our hearing acuity is about the same volume of tone we can hear almost equally. But the attention connected to that hearing is quite different. When what they have found is that on average, women are much more likely to pay attention to sounds, whereas to get the attention of a little boy, it's just going to need to be louder. And where that plays out in the public school is that, teachers speaking in a normal tone of voice, the little girls might be paying attention, but honestly, it turns out that if the teacher wants the little boys to listen, all she has to do is talk louder. It's funny, but that's what the research has shown. Women tend to be more sensitive to smells. Now, the first exposure to a smell, men and women might react the same, but women sort of get primed, so they're much more likely to notice it the second time they're exposed to it. Risk-taking and aggression, those are personality traits, and common sense has told us forever that men are inherently the risk takers and more aggressive. Now, the revisionists, the ones who want to say that this is all socially constructed, have challenged this. They rejected that. But in fact, it turns out that not only is this reproducible in humans, we see it in many primates. For instance, chimpanzees, little boy chimpanzees prefer to play with trucks, and little girl chimpanzees like to play with dolls. And it's not because they've been trained that way by their society or culture. There was a population of Japanese macaques, a kind of monkey, in Texas at a wildlife refuge. And researchers noticed, strangely, that once they hit a certain age, that the females vastly outnumbered the males in the population. They looked for all possible reasons, weakness, diseases, some kind of genetic thing. And eventually what they found out was that the males were getting killed crossing the street, that they would just take chances. They'd see the car coming and say, I think I can make it, but they didn't make it. That they were just more risk-taking. Chimpanzees also are much more aggressive, that the male chimpanzees are much more likely to attack other males, to attack other females. They're just inherently more violent than female chimpanzees. So the fact that this exists in animals that are very similar to us kind of blows out of the water the idea that all these are just determined by society and by the schools and by television and the toys we give them when they're young. Boys and girls different in learning style. Overall, it works out that girls learn better when they're in a good, close personal relationship with a teacher, whereas little boys, the relationship doesn't matter that much. They're just more interested in mastering the subject. Boys and girls establish friendships in very different ways. Response to babies. You'd see little boys and they have no interest in little babies, and the little girls, cuddle them, respond to them in a very different way. Clearly the sex drive is very different, and men have a much higher sex drive and a less discriminating sex drive. Their attitudes towards sex, the act of sex, men are less emotionally involved with it, whereas with women, the act of sex itself is a much more intimate, personal, relational thing. Another area is empathy versus symptoms orientation, and I'm going to talk about that here. Overall, women are higher on the empathy scale and men are higher on the system scale, so that men are more abstract thinking, more likely to be interested in sort of the science, the mathematics, and less emotionally attuned. Where this comes up is that there's a theory that autism reflects an extreme male brain, because autists, those who are autistic, are impaired in their ability to pick up on social cues, to read body language. So that shows basically a lack of empathy or an inability to experience that sort of empathy. And in one of the largest studies ever done examining sex differences, with over 670,000 participants in this major paper came out in 2018 finding that overall females scored much higher in the empathy quotient and males higher in the systems quotient. Now, how does that play out? Well, as it plays out, here's on the top you have women, and extreme empathy is on the left-hand side, the purple and the blue. And another difference that emerges are women have much more sense of color than men, so they might call this something different. But they tend to be lower on the systems. In the male on the bottom, much lower in empathy from here to here. The extreme empathy is much, much lower. And the extreme systems is over here. The systems, you see a much higher proportion of males. In the extreme systems, extreme lack of empathy would be considered sort of moving into the autistic direction. This might explain why autism is more common among males. But another difference that's very important to point out here, that you don't see a dividing wall. There's nothing that completely separates men from women. There's an extraordinary amount of overlap, because still, even though it's fewer, there are a lot of men who are very empathetic, and there are a lot of women who are very systems oriented. And that's an important thing to remember, that there is no absolute dividing line. So, is there such thing as a male brain and a female brain? Are they inherently different? Well, as a radiologist, I've looked at probably hundreds of thousands of brains on CTs and MRs over the course of my career, and there is no way I could tell you, looking at a brain scan, an MRI, whether it was a man or a woman. There are people who claim it can be done with computers, but I can't do it. So it's not primarily a difference in brain structure, what we look at, but in the function, the way the brain operates. And this is affected to a great degree by what happens in utero when the baby is developing. The Y chromosome has a single gene that is the testosterone receptor. The testosterone binds to that, and if it succeeds, then it releases genetic information, the proteins that activate normal male development. And so it creates a brain that is wired in a male sense by the time the baby is born. Now, in females, there's something called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, CAH. And these are women who from a very early age, very young girls, have much higher circulating levels of testosterone. It's a medical disorder. It's not intersex, but it is a medical disorder. And what the research shows is that these women are sort of masculized, and then across all these parameters that I discussed, they are more male in many respects. They show stronger expression of these various tendencies that are shown. So this is another point of evidence that these differences are real when you see a continuum, and those who are biologically somewhere in the middle also end up being neurologically somewhere in the middle. Now, I mentioned in the Y chromosome for the male that there is a testosterone receptor, and this is a very interesting gene. There's something on there called the CAG codon. It just repeats, and they found out that the more repeats you have, the less effect testosterone has on the brain. And the fewer repeats of that CAG codon on the gene, the more affect testosterone. And so they have even looked at men who have higher versus lower numbers of these codons. And again, there's a spectrum. The ones who have the most masculinized personality are the ones that have the fewest repeats of the codon. And the ones who are less stereotypically masculine have more of the codon. So again, more biological evidence that these are not a matter of socialization. The evidence became so overwhelming that by January of 2017, the Journal of Neuroscience Research came out with an entire journal dedicated to review articles on the differences between male and female brains. Much of this is free and online if you're interested, but the editor for this journal, Larry Cahill, in his opening editorial said the notion that sex matters fundamentally, powerfully, and pervasively for all of neuroscience, not just for reproduction, is an idea whose time indeed has come. So on this area, the science is settled. We can safely say that the science is settled, that men and women are different on a neurological level. Now, I'm not saying that they're the same, that all males are one way and all females are the other way, because there are several caveats that I want to introduce here before I wrap up this section. So before I move on to the next section, I just want to make 4 stipulations. First, that both masculine and feminine traits exist along a continuum within the male and female sexes. That it's not a situation all men are like this and all women are like that. There's a lot of overlap. Some things there's a lot of overlap, like we saw with the empathy versus systems orientation. Others there's very little. The sex drive is very different between men and women. There are very few women who have the sex drive of a male or vice versa. Second, that a lot of these roles really are socially and culturally determined, that the people I talked about at the beginning, they weren't 100% wrong. Some of the job assignments, the stereotypical behaviors are determined by society and culture, and they vary from culture to culture. And this shows up even in the New Testament, where he talks about how women and men should conduct themselves within a church that is culturally appropriate to first century Roman Empire. The third is that although there is a lot of overlap, it varies with trait. So, the sex drive may be very different, but other things are very similar. Last is that some of these gender differences actually decrease with age and experience. Little girls can grow up to be very confident, aggressive women, and little boys can grow up to be very loving, caring fathers of their infant children. This is important to remember. So where this shows up is that the sex differences are actually greatest in children and decrease with age. And this also is the exact opposite of what you would predict if the hypothesis were true that the sex differences were socially constructed. If it was an effect of society and culture, they should increase with age, not decrease. But you're born with them, and the net impact of living and of culture is actually to decrease these differences. So moving on to the next section, part 2, the paradigm for biblical sexuality. What I would define as biblical sexuality is a premise that sexual intercourse should exist only within a committed lifelong marriage, and no sexual activity of any type outside of that lifelong bond between man and woman. That means no sex with anybody before marriage, no sex with anybody outside of marriage. It is incorporated into human design. It's part of our design. And what we would say, this reflects natural law. We intuitively know this is the way it should be. Now, because I'm saying as a hypothesis that it's natural law, we would predict that if we depart from this, that there are going to be consequences, and indeed that is the case. what does it mean that it's incorporated into design? It means that we follow that principle, we're much more likely to succeed in life, that things are just going to work out better. Anything departing from that goes against natural law, it goes against our design and is going to lead to adverse consequences. Now, we're not specifically talking about the Mosaic Law. The Mosaic Law was a contract for the nation of Israel. It is not and was never intended to be the ultimate answer of what is right and what is wrong. That's what I talked about last week, the eternal law of God, which is also expressed in natural law, which God has implanted in our hearts. So marriage is designed by God based on these premises that a man and a woman come together for a lifelong exchange, creating a home or creating a family, the ideal situation for the raising of children. It's based upon the principles of diversity, that men and women are different, and because they are different in different ways, they complement one another. It's based on a mutual dependence that each can bring strengths to that relationship to make up for deficiencies in the other, and each come with our own weaknesses that the other one can help us out with. And the third is that of procreation, that it's a God-given mandate to go out and fill the world, to create the next generation, to disciple them, and to keep the seed of Adam continuing through human history. The PCA Study Committee, in their report on page 41, talked about diversity. And let me quote from there because it was beautifully written. Male and female each have excellencies and glories, perspectives and powers that the other gender does not have and cannot reproduce. Now, in the first section, we showed that scientifically this is true, that men and women are unique and different in different ways. Now, maybe this overstates it a little bit because there really is no absolute dividing line between one and the other. There's probably nothing you can name about men that there are no women who possess, and vice versa. But as a general rule, that is true in most cases. So why does it matter? Why does complementarity matter? Complementarity is this concept that we each have our strengths, we have our weaknesses, we come together, and together we are stronger as two than we are as one. Now, this is not the same as complementarianism, which is a theological position, which I'm not going to talk about in this series. Why complementarity matters, it's optimal for child rearing. Intuitively, you know that men and women, mothers and fathers, play different roles in the raising of children. They have different attitudes. Men tend to be much more confident, tend to be more the risk takers. Women tend to be more the protectors, the nurturers. You talk about the fathers are the ones that are going to push those little boys and little girls to reach out and take risks, and the mothers are going to be ones say, oh no, don't take that risk. But either you can err in both directions, and the beauty of God's design is that together we can balance out our errors. Many other ways where we know that it's optimal for child rearing, and I'll talk about that more later on. It enhances maturity in a healthy relationship, that in a healthy relationship with mature individuals, you can see the weaknesses and strengths of the other, and you can learn from them, and they can learn from you, and you can accept some of their advice and suggestions. Men sometimes need to have some of their impulses toned down a bit. Women sometimes need to have some of their weaknesses compensated. And together we grow, whereas apart we don't. It incentivizes personal growth. There's a reason to grow in maturity when you're seeking a marital relationship. If you're going to keep that relationship alive, you have to work out those rough spots. It's optimal for the functioning of a household. Households just function better when all the jobs are taken care of, when the house cleaning, the cooking, the breadwinning, the yard, when all these are taken together. and some people are going to be better at one thing than another. It's optimal for long-term happiness and mental health. And what we find is that monogamous societies compared to polygamous ones outperformed all other societies in economic terms and in social terms. So I mentioned that some of these positive outcomes of marriage are improved health. What research has found is that it leads to higher levels of happiness, higher economic prosperity, better physical health, increased lifespans, and children fare much better when they're raised by two biological parents, a mother and a father. They do much better than children born out of wedlock or children who are in blended homes or who were products of divorce. The data in this area is really too extensive, but there's one review from 2010 that shows some of the findings I'm talking about. This was a review article from the Journal of Family Issues in 2010. They reported some of the points here: that marriage reduces depression, that unmarried adults are more likely to drink, use marijuana, or drive recklessly. The research shows that married men and women experience lower mortality at every age relative to those who remain unmarried or lose their spouse through widowhood or divorce. And a number of rigorous studies reveal that marriage can also lead to better general physical health and better outcomes for some specific health conditions, including arthritis, hypertension, and heart disease. Now, when people engage in sexual intercourse, there are some biological processes that happen here within the brain, neurophysiological processes. The sex act results in a release of dopamine, and dopamine is the reward transmitter. The brain craves dopamine, and when it gets a dopamine hit, it likes it so much, the brain adapts to trying to repeat the behavior. Dopamine is what drives so many of the addictions and thrill-seeking and other activities. It drives a sense of pleasure, but it also has the effect of kind of rewiring the brain and shaping that brain. So once you've experienced something that leads to a dopamine hit, you want to do it more and more. The downside of that is you start to build up a tolerance to the event, to the dopamine, and so subsequent experiences need a higher and higher level of intensity to reach the same effect. When people engage in sexual intercourse, there is a release of oxytocin, particularly among females. This is the commonly referred to as the cuddling hormone, but it forms a bonding, an attachment. It wires the brain to be bonded to the person involved. It is the hormone that it helps women to bond to their newborn children, but it also causes women to be bonded emotionally to a man with whom they have sex. It's designed by God to work within marriage to allow partners to bond together for a lifetime. But when it happens outside of a marital context, it leads to bonding in what's a non-permanent relationship. And when that bond is broken, which happens most of the time, then there's going to be an inevitable pain associated with the breaking of that bond. There's less research on vasopressin, but it's a similar hormone in men that has a similar effect. Although in general, men are much more impervious and generally tougher when it comes to sex and having emotional consequences, but it's not zero. It affects them very much as well. These behaviors then tend to rewire the brain by forming new synapses, new connections between neurons, pruning away some of the neurons that aren't active, and it actually changes the brain. So whatever activity it's involved in, including if that activity is sex, the brain starts to think, well, this is normal and this is how it should be. And you keep going back and repeating the same sort of behavior. It becomes self-sustaining. So when people engage in non-marital sexual intercourse, the brain is changed, and there are consequences to these alterations in the brain. They are much more likely to be depressed. It's strongly linked with premarital and extramarital sex. They are 1.5 to 3.5 times more likely to consider suicide. The lower range is in heterosexual sex. The higher range is those found among those who have sex with partners of the same sex. They are 3.5 times more likely to consider suicide. You have the oxytocin bonding that I talked about that leads to pain, emotional pain, psychological pain when that bond breaks up. And because of this behavior becomes repeated and rewires the brain, having multiple partners prior to marriage reduces the capacity to form a committed relationship. They tend to think that is normal, and so if they do get married, and it's harder to form a permanent bond and see that person as a lifelong change, as a permanent partner rather than just another one in a series of partners. And overall, out of all this, women do suffer much more than men. They suffer more emotionally and more psychologically. There are medical consequences of non-marital sex. The most obvious is pregnancy, and this happens very often. Many cohabitating relationships end up in unintended pregnancies. Many teenage relationships end up with unintended pregnancies. Now, if you look at the science, a birth control pill is over 99% effective, but these quoted efficacies assume perfect compliance on the part of the user, and the people who are most likely to engage in sex are immature risk takers who are least likely to be compliant with birth control, whether it's the pill or condoms or any of the other devices. So the result ends up being that abortion serves to step in as a means of birth control. So one of the consequences of non-marital sex is the extermination of unborn life. Sexually transmitted diseases are a major impact of this. Now, if everyone were monogamous for life, there would be no sexually transmitted diseases. It would be, as if you could have stopped COVID at the very beginning. If there would be nobody spreading it, so they wouldn't even exist. But the fact is that they do exist, and they continue to increase in severity. Some of these are so severe that they actually lead to death. Some of the leading causes of death attributable to sex would be AIDS. It was an explosion in the 80s and 90s, especially in the homosexual community and in parts of Africa. Human papillomavirus, which is the one linked to cervical cancer, now is actually causing an epidemic of oral cancers in young men and women who contract it through oral sex. And violence. There is a strong connection between domestic violence and sex, so that those who engage in it, those who are practice, are increasing their risk of having that relationship end violently. From the CDC reporting less than a year ago, April 2021, the last full year for which there is data, reported sexually transmitted diseases reach all-time high for the 6th consecutive year. So this is an ongoing medical social crisis, and it's 100% attributable to extramarital sex, to human behavior. But the people who should care about this most, the ones who are most likely to get it, tend not to care. And why would that? Now, having considered the difference between male and female brains and established that men, especially young men, tend to be risk takers and naturally aggressive, talking to young men about sexually transmitted diseases is probably going to have very little impact among the ones who are most likely to engage in it. We probably need to use other strategies. So I've talked about medical and psychological consequences of non-marital sex. Let's now talk about some of the social consequences. Because of cheap sex, people are less happy, they're more frustrated, they're more lonely, because one of the best cures for loneliness is not sex, but marriage, and they're less likely to become married in the current social and sexual environment. It leads to reduced religious engagement. Couples that cohabitate or non-cohabitating couples that are sexually active are much less likely to attend church. even if they come from a church background. It leads to more liberal political tendencies. Now, you can judge for yourself whether that's good or bad, but it's been well documented. It leads to masculine acedia. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, acedia is sort of a lassitude, a laziness, indifference. For some men, certainly not all, but for some men, there's a subset for whom marriage would have been the only incentive for them to succeed in life, to try in school, to get and keep a job, to develop a disciplined personal life. But if they can get sex without having to do all of that, there are some men who are completely comfortable with that and have no reason to go any further. A non-marital sex leads to reduced marriage rates. We're seeing that worldwide. Fewer and fewer people are getting married, and mostly it's not because the women don't want to, but because the men don't have to. We're also seeing reduced fertility because of the postponement of marriage, and women become less fertile with increasing age. And with fewer marriages, there are fewer babies being born. That also means in the future, little boys and girls will have fewer brothers and sisters and fewer aunts and uncles and fewer cousins because you have so many single child families that has became kind of normative in modern China with their one child policy. So I talked 2 weeks ago about cheap sex, Mark Regnerus, how this operates. In the market of sexual economics, males dominate the demand side, where females are typically the gatekeepers, whereas females can dominate the market for marriage. The price of sex is reflected in what it costs an individual to obtain a partner. What has driven down the price of sex are some of the things I've listed here. The pill, of course, was the first one to dramatically reduce the risk to both men and women, but especially women. But in reducing the cost, it also made sex cheaper in economic terms. Some of the more contemporary trends include internet dating and smartphone apps that some researchers have referred to as nothing more than sex delivery systems. They don't increase the demand or the supply, but they do make the markets run more efficiently. The sexual marketplace has led to lower expectations from females. Women are just more willing to engage in sex outside of marriage, and they're also willing to settle for lower standards. Then there's this changing approach to marriage that I've talked about, the traditional foundational view versus the capstone view. Well, if you postpone a marriage, then it's a lot longer for men and women to remain celibate. In this day, it's almost an achievement for a man to make it to 21 and still remain celibate. It's almost heroic for one to make it to 32 or 35. There's a time factor, and the longer and longer you postpone marriage, the longer and longer you have to resist the very powerful drives that each of us experience. Pornography has reduced the price of sex because, the cheapest sex of all is what pornography has to offer. Marriage, on the other hand, remains expensive because of the capstone view that I talked about. Roy Baumeister from Florida State was actually the one who developed the term sexual economics. And in 2012, he wrote the following: "Giving young men easy access to abundant sexual satisfaction deprives society of one of its ways to motivate them to contribute valuable achievements to the culture." Now, cohabitation itself has significant drawbacks, and there are decades now of research on marriage and the effects of cohabitation. And compared to lifelong marriage, cohabitating relationships demonstrate less bonding, less emotional closeness between the individual. They result in less intimacy, less sharing of your personal lives, there's less doing things together and more each living their own independent life. There's less commitment. There's you never know whether the partner might move out the next day or the next week or the next year. There's not an implicit understanding that this is for life. Even though many marriages fail, over half of marriages do succeed long term, and nothing remotely resembling that can be said of cohabiting relationships. There's less financial security. Cohabitors tend to keep their personal finances very separate, not shared together. They're more likely to focus more on advancing their own personal career, their own personal agenda, and what's best for them, rather than teaming up for what's best for the two of us together. It puts children at risk. If there are children involved, they're more likely to be victims of abuse in the presence of an unrelated mother or father in the house, unrelated man or woman, especially in the household of an unrelated man. That dramatically increases the risk of child abuse. Cohabitating relationships are more violent. There are high levels of domestic violence. There's more cheating. Both men and women are much more likely to be having affairs with other partners when they're just in a cohabiting relationship. And supposing that they do eventually get married, they're less likely to succeed in that marriage, especially if they've previously cohabited with other people. Here's a large review of studies from 2018 from the Journal of Marriage and Family. And you can see on the chart, the top, if they have not cohabitated, a first marriage, the cumulative chances of survival stays well above 50%, even going out 30 years. Whereas people who had cohabitated with someone other, this is looking specifically at women, if they cohabited with other men prior to their husband, it's much, much lower. If they only cohabitated with other men and did not cohabit with their current husband, it's the lowest of all. There's almost a minimal chance that that marriage is going to go past, make it to 20 years. And you see there's a tremendous drop off, 50% just in the first 5 years. Now, there's not a lot of drive right now for polygamy, but there has been research on it, and it also is detrimental to women's health, particularly individual studies. Here's from a paper in 2013. Studies report higher prevalence of somatization, that's pain syndromes, depression, anxiety, hostility, psychotic behavior, and psychiatric disorder in polygynous wives. That's wives in a polygamous relationship, as well as reduced life and marital satisfaction, problematic family functioning, and low self-esteem. In a review of history and economics published in 2022, the paper is called The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage. They found that historically, across history and across cultures, that monogamous societies outperformed all others, that they experienced lower crime rates, that there was less gender inequality, that there was improved economic productivity, and that there was less child neglect and abuse. So science strongly supports monogamy even over polygamy. And the last consequence I'll talk about is the effect upon children, that children thrive best when raised in a household comprised of a biological father, a biological mother, and a stable home environment. Every departure from that leads to some compromise and poor outcomes among children. By almost every parameter, they do worse. Now, you can depart from that in various ways. It can be unmarried pregnancy. It can be divorce. It can be adoption. Adoption is good for children who have no other option if they're orphans, but there are other situations where adoption exists solely for the gratification of the parents. You might think of some of these means of artificial conception to produce children for homosexual couples, where there's a biological father or a biological mother is excluded from the equation. By almost every measurable parameter, children fare better when they are raised by their married biological parents. They are safer, there's greater chance of child abuse or trauma when they're deprived of this stable household. There are issues of identity that children who don't know their biological parents have a void in their life that they seek to fill and struggle with that. All parameters of mental and physical health, we're looking at depression, suicide, anxiety, all these are reduced in a stable biological household. They do better economically, they do better academically, they do better socially. And it's not something that can be replaced by having two mothers or two fathers. It's not that children need two parents. There's no such thing as parenting. There's mothering and fathering, and children need both. Children need a mother and a father, and that is the optimal situation. Now, there are many cases where it's unavoidable and it can't be helped, but there are many more cases where it can be helped. So here I'm going to wrap up. The third element of my triad is that because of the fall, there are consequences, and these are immense, and that's going to be the entire focus of our next talk. Because of the fall, there's now a wedge between men and women. Marriage has been corrupted, sexuality has been corrupted, and child rearing has corrupted. And there are consequences to all that have led to harm, which are demonstrable and measurable, and we will talk about next week. So summing up today, men and women are biologically different and complement one another. Sex within biblical marriage is the optimal paradigm for human flourishing, and departure from biblical sexuality inflicts massive individual and civilizational harm. That third item will be the subject of next week's talk, the victims of the sexual revolution. And that will be the end of this talk, and I thank you for your attention, and may God bless.